Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. We just need to straighten something out before we begin. The rumours circulating in the national media about a Talking Absolute Worship Christmas party during lockdown this year. We have to categorically deny that any such party took place, and the photographs don't depict such a thing. It was a work meeting talking about the wedding feast at Cana, which explains the wine bottles, and Peter always dresses like that. So having got that out of the way, my panel is with me again, where we're looking at Transfiguration, which is a kind of a transition Sunday between Epiphany and Lent. So, Peter, you have all four passages untouched before you. Where would you be thinking of going with your preaching this week?
Okay, well, as far as the readings are concerned, I haven't looked at them all. I'm going to go with Psalm 99 and the Luke passage. And I've decided to go down the path of thinking about sacred spaces. Seems to me we need to be able to go a little bit off-piste because firstly, the Transfiguration is not easy for any of us to understand. Even those of us who are Christians and may have been for many years probably still have a bit of a struggle with it. And secondly, it's not easy to get new perspective on this particular story. And I'm one of those who started off with dark hair and has gradually worked through to thinner hair and grey hair. And I've used these passages loads of times and thought, do you know, what have I got new to say about the Transfiguration? So that's why I thought I'm going to think about sacred spaces. So I'm going to use Psalm 99 and Luke to think about that and their sacred spaces' significance to us. One for me is the chapel at Westminster College, which has always been a sort of thin place for me where I've spent a lot of time just on my own and in that space. And equally, I would say walking the Suffolk coast does the same thing for me. And they've always felt like places of encounter. So I'm thinking about the thin places. Of course, the danger of experiences like that in our Luke reading today is that because they're so rare, we may fail to learn from them as we ought, or we may want to somehow try and make them our norm and therefore withdraw from the day-to-day struggles of life rather than apply those moments to the life that we're called to live. So the aim, I think, of the talk is to think about sacred places to us and how we use the experience of them in daily life and as sustenance for our faith. So I think I'd start by asking where people encounter God and feel God's presence the most. I would expect, could be wrong, but I would expect nature to feature prominently via beaches, countryside, mountains, all kinds of different ways, gardening. Perhaps cathedrals that are designed to dwarf and create that sense of the other worldiness. That even today make us hush and wonder in their glory, or they do for me when I walk inside some of them. I'm just, wow. Even now. It may be in reading scripture, or it may be in prayer that God feels really close. I think where I want to go with this is because what I would love the majority to say is when I enter this building to worship is where I expect an encounter with God. But I have a sense that even in our regular churchgoers and the people who make up our congregations, that would either be a real minority or none at all. I just wonder. I mean, it's going to be fascinating on this Sunday because I am leading worship and I will be asking this question: where is it that you feel those places of encounter are? And I don't think many will say here on a Sunday morning. And I think that's a massive question for us all to ask. Well, why? When we come to worship together as the people of God, Are we not expecting an encounter with the living God? Or is it not an expectation of us to actually have that? So based on that, I think developing the thinking of why does it not feel like a doorway to heaven when we come to worship here? And if possible, to really have an interactive morning and an interactive talky part of it, letting the congregation think about that for themselves. And then how do we rethink our worship spaces to be a space of expectation for encounter with God, and could be enhanced by art, creative images, lighting? If the sacred space is a commonly held one for many of the congregation that's beyond our buildings, are we actually brave enough to say, well then shouldn't we be going to worship there more often? If we actually had 50% of our congregation saying a same place in the community we're based in, that's where God feels so close. Do we take the risk and say, well, maybe once a month we worship there instead of within these walls? And so it's then about how might we tell the story of our encounters with God in these sacred spaces, the same God that met with Peter, James and John, and who have shared the story of their encounter with us today. How in those sacred spaces, how do we tell that story of who we encounter, when we encounter the living God, how do we tell the story of that God to those that we meet? I mean, their attempt was one attempt. How do we attempt to tell that story day by day? And I think that's where I would go with this, and they're the sort of things I'd pluck out and pull out. And I think it's about allowing the time and space for people to really think and develop their own thinking as well, and then bring it together as a congregation. Because if we finish up in a place where we're saying, this isn't the place I really encounter God, it asks really big questions of us, of how we're worshipping Him and our expectations of that. So that's fairly short, but I think it's enough ideas for us to tug about and pull out from that.
Thank you, Peter. There's all sorts of rich pathways that lead out from those ideas. I often find myself preaching about this idea of thin places on midnight Christmas Eve services, and I think I probably don't describe them as places, but as more as moments rather than places, because I'm kind of skeptical that one place is more holy than another. I've written down on this piece of paper with the readings what makes a place holy, which is similar to your question about sacred spaces. What is it that makes a place holy? Is it the place? And I resist that. There's something in me that resists that Iona and Nuneaton bus station, it is just as likely that you will encounter God in both those places. So there is something that resists it, but there's also something that responds to it. So I'm kind of mixed up on this whole thing about whether it's the place or whether it's the moment. And in trying to recreate the moment, we end up building the booths and trying to control when God appears, because we can't manufacture that, can we? That experience. No. We can't. And you do hear that. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say we can make an encounter with God happen, but you do hear that when people talk about getting worship right and doing the right number of songs to soften people up emotionally for an encounter with God, or they wouldn't use that language, but we just need to do this all in the right order and get the liturgy right and the setting, and then God will appear.
I think it's why I like the idea of sacred spaces rather than sacred places, because creating the space of the encounter with God is very different from the place.
That's a fantastic distinction and a really helpful one, that it's creating a space and where that space needs to be created. Sometimes maybe that's in my head. And sometimes it's sometimes it is a geographical space. Quite clearly, that's people's experience, isn't it? That it is a geographical space, a location. a particular room. For me, it tends to be very simple rooms, chapels, whitewashed walls, all the cliched stuff. But I'm trying to I did actually do a sabbatical where I went round some of these places that are said to be, have always been places of pilgrimage in the UK, and specifically to explore this idea about what makes those places of pilgrimage or sacred spaces. And it was an interesting trip. I don't think I ever really ever fully grasped the answer, but some of these places left me completely cold. Like Iona, for instance. Just throw that one in. And what's that hideous place in Norfolk? Walsingham.
Yeah.
But then others, Holy Island. Despite my rational head saying, yes, Nuneaton bus station is the same as Holy Island, it's not. But why isn't it? And there's so many rich paths leading from that question that I think that's an absolutely fantastic place to start, Peter. In fact, I might take the Sunday off and come and listen to what you've got to say about that at St Ives or wherever you're going to be. Sacred spaces. I always think it's interesting that in the lectionary for Luke, they have included 37 to 43. So it's almost like they're up the mountain, they're experiencing a sacred space that they want to prolong, and then the next day they're down in the valley, and everything's gone wrong again. They're struggling to reconnect with this experience that they've had because it just doesn't work. I kind of think ministry feels a bit like that, doesn't it? We're given these occasional glimpses of mountaintop experiences, but most of it is struggling to make a difference down in the valley, and how the two, Sunday to Monday or whichever way around it is in our lives, it seems to be a disconnect sometimes, doesn't there, between how we access that. I really do like that distinction of a space or a place. I'm gonna go with that. So so I think that's a fruitful direction. Not that it's up to me to judge whether or not it is a fruitful direction. That's the direction you're going in. I will certainly be going in that direction too. But Lithan, what was standing out for you as you looked at these passages?
Well, I'm not actually preaching on this Sunday. We're supposed to be somewhere on holiday, Phil.
Are we?
We're going to go to visit Peter.
Phil was not going with
might
you
be a holiday.
What better way to spend your holiday than visiting Peter? Yeah.
So I think I've just got a few glimpses and comments rather than anything fully 3-point sermon. One is Ruth Everhart. I read her description of being on a pilgrimage in Israel and Palestine, where they were allowed to go on a trip to the Mount of Transfiguration, and you start off on a coach and then you have to get out the coaches because it's windy, so you're in taxis and there's a long journey in the taxis and you get out feeling bedraggled, and they say you've got 30 minutes on this mountaintop, and then she writes, we emerge at the top breathless, rumpled, disorientated, enough for glory. This was the very spot where Jesus shone like the sun. The veil between heaven and earth was pierced for a moment, and they built a church there. And I think it's that thing of, because we want to capture the moment, it's such a thing in us. Phil and I, when we were very young, did an event at Yardley Hastings where we did Holy Week and Easter for people 2 months in advance, so they could do lots of different creative ideas for Holy Week and Easter. And one was we gave people the Stations of the Cross to act out, and they were so imaginative. They were just awesome. And there was one in particular I thought, I wish I'd filmed this. I wish I'd filmed this to keep it. And I thought immediately of this moment going, sometimes we just have to be in the moment and go, this is amazing. This is really helping me with my faith. And then let it go, rather than, having a souvenir or a capture of it. I'm always struck when there are nursery in the days when you weren't quite so careful, nurseries doing their nativity plays, and parents elbowing each other to film it, and you think, just enjoy it. You know, you're not thinking, you're trying to get your child in shot, you're not getting the bigger picture, you're just focusing in on that. And I think there's a lot about that. And I read that Peter's idea about building the booths isn't quite as weird as it sounds. So my phone's thinking I'm talking to it, because the Sukkot and Tabernacles is the time when the Jewish people remember when they were in the wilderness and that they had to live in tents. So all of that is giving that. So the fact that he's made that link between Jesus' glory and Moses' glory, and wanting to kind of sit with that for a while, it does make sense in a way. I've never really understood that before, why he says booths, because I kind of think of Punch and Judy. It's the only sort of booth I know in my head. So that's kind of helpful. But that idea that we do want to hold on to this, which is why in Luke, adding in that passage at the end of they go back down and it's business as usual. And in some of the Gospels, the disciples who weren't the chosen ones who went to experience this from Jesus, they've already been trying to heal this lad and it hasn't worked. And then Jesus comes along and saves the day. But it's that sense of even Jesus doesn't think he should be staying up there forever. This time is a resource and a gift for him to get on with what he should be doing. And so that sense, that, which kind of links probably with what Peter was saying, that worship is a resource for us to help us do our ministry. Worship, the time of worship is not the high point of the week in that sense. It's not the tick, I've done my ministry now because I've come to worship. Worship is the thing that should build us up, that hopefully has moments of epiphany in it, and of revelation that will enable us to get on with what we need to do. And we're not called to be Jesus, so it's unlikely that we're going to go straight out to healing people unless that's our profession, but rather we're to be called to walk in the way of Jesus. And that might be where I'd bring in some of the 2 Corinthians reading. I would have a caution about 2 Corinthians because there's a dig at those who are followers of Moses rather than understanding who Jesus is. So I might either leave out verses 14 and 15 or start at 16 and explain a bit about what had come before, so that we're not kind of going, yeah, because we know better. We're the ones who have the complete revelation. But there is something about, as Christians, our faith should be shining out of us. And I quite often talk about people that I met on the Ginger group, Charles and Paul in Brixham, who were people that when I met them, their faith, their love for Jesus just shined out of their faces all the time. And I just think that's how we should be. So it's not about staying in that moment of worship, but that as Moses, when he'd encountered God, carried something of that with him, that's something that we need to carry out of that time of worship together, because that's when our ministry starts.
Yeah, I'd made a very similar note alongside Moses' face shining about the effect of the law changing Moses. It changes his face, and trying to reflect on how are we changed by encounters with God when we go out into the world in which we live. I think that's really a powerful question to ask a congregation, and in a sense it's about, who is this for? Is worship for me, to feed me? And yes, in one sense it is, but people often talk about recharging their batteries, and that's what worship is. But this Moses thing sort of seems to suggest it's not just for him. This encounter with God isn't for Moses, and that encounter on the top of Mount Tabor, or whichever mount it wasn't just for those 3 disciples. It was for the world, and it should shine out from them for the world to feed from. this encounter with God changes us, so we offer that life-changing encounter to the world around us. It's not for me. So the inclination to go and get it again and again and again, I think that's what's wrong with the disciples' response, is that I just want more of this for me. Let's just stay here and I can get more of this. Where Jesus is saying, no, it's not for you, this encounter with God, it's to change you with your encounters with the world. And through that, other people encounter some of this that you've seen on the mountaintop. Maybe, although their faces didn't shine, but Moses did. So there you go. I like that a lot. I think there's a lot to work with. The tabernacle's an interesting thing that you mentioned as well, isn't it? And the booths, they're movable. The tabernacle deliberately and specifically was movable. The place that was the location of the glory of God, the Shekinah, is it Shekinah, the glory of God, the tabernacle, they would literally roll it up, put it on the back of animals or carry it across the desert and then set it up somewhere else, and the glory of God moved with them. Wherever they happened to be and pitched camp, that's where the glory of God existed, in that movable tabernacle, which we often have prayers, tent dwelling God, don't we? The God who moves around, whereas we kind of want God to be fixed in a place where we can go and visit him. But, I don't know. There's certainly something tabernacly to be said about this movable thing that you can take down to the valley with you. Yeah, Peter.
But maybe that's actually one of the problems, that we've somehow domesticated God into those places where we think we go to meet with God, rather than allowing God to be at large in all of life and every day of life.
Yeah. I wonder. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think exactly. There's something you said earlier on reminded me of the quote that preachers have to use on this Sunday. That is the only quote anyone ever uses, from Annie Dillard. You must have come across it, where she asks the question, what we expect. You were asking earlier on, Peter, what we expect from Sunday morning and the places where we worship, and our Sunday morning services. What are we expecting from them? And her observation was, looking at congregations, they're not expecting very much from it at all. And she says, stewards should be giving out life jackets. We should be lashed to our pews if we seriously mean we're here for an encounter with the Almighty God. And that's the only Annie Dillard quote I've ever heard used anywhere, but it's a fantastic one that I often use on Transfiguration Sunday. What are we actually expecting? Have people got any expectation at all when they come on Sunday morning? Or is it just, it is a habit in some extent. It's not always a bad thing to have habits, but is it only a habit? Or is it more, are we expecting anything to happen on a Sunday morning? And if we're not, well, maybe God will surprise us, but is it any surprise that nothing happens? I don't know, but also in sermons, I think we've probably come across this in worship, that we carefully design and construct because we know what we want our congregations to take from it. How often is it that actually the thing they talk to you afterwards, that if they've had an encounter somehow, it's nothing to do with anything that you planned or wanted to say? Is it, oh, thank you for saying that? And you say, you've pressed them further, what? And they'll say something that you never said at all. It was not, it wasn't part of your intention, but they've heard something, and that's an encounter with God, isn't it? That I haven't planned, but that might well happen in worship.
It's a reminder to us of our words, isn't it? I was doing a service a few weeks ago, and I built in silence and that, and the thing I got the most comment about was, I really appreciated the silences, Peter.
You should do it more. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. All right. We're not expecting silence from you, Robert. We want voluble advice, inspiration, and deep theology. Where are you going with these readings this week?
Same sort of place. It is the problem that, yes, we do these passages a lot, and I'm always drawn I have a sort of thing about thin places and thin spaces and thin moments, often which is linked to narrowboats. So because for me, it's something to do with them going up the mountain. It's something to do with the action of stepping away. And I'd want to talk about that. And I think when you were talking about people come to church and it isn't where they, oh yes, isn't where they encounter God. Because so much of church life is about the business of keeping the church going. And I think the trouble is that we worship in the place that we're keeping going and worrying about. And I've got an image as I speak of standing at the front and looking at the back of my church and watching my church secretary checking that the doors were all, you know, as the service was going, checking that the doors were shut and looking to see if anybody else was arriving. No way in which she was engaging, because this place had so much baggage with it, I suppose. So for me, as Phil has illustrated, the idea of the stepping away, and for me, the notional stepping off the side of the canal onto the narrowboat, hopefully onto the narrowboat, not into the canal, is a metaphor for that stepping away into this place that is other. So there's something about the action. But I also think that thing, I haven't heard that Annie Dillard quote. But when I look at this, I always think and I'm repeating words that have been said, I think I can have this habit of sort of domesticating God and bringing it down to stuff that I hope we can understand. And I think that this passage in Luke and the Psalm, they're saying that God is, you know, let peoples tremble. You know, God's not domestic. God's not understandable. God's something else. So I'd want to be talking about that. And then it's probably what people always talk about, but this getting away and seeing things clearly, which I think, again, is when you go out for a walk or when you get on the narrowboat and you leave everything behind, your mind works and God is in that. And then you see things in a different way. And when you come back, you're better able, hopefully, to deal with the stuff when you come back down the mountain. And yet, worship for me, it's like the fuel that fires you, or, you know, gives you the energy to move on and to be a Christian as well as you can out in the community. So I'd want to be talking about that. What's this for? Why do we come together? What's it all about? What a thin place is for? What's an encounter of God about? Yeah. But you've said it all already.
Yeah, just that Robert and I do spend a bit of time on narrowboat sometimes, and we've got our next narrowboat trip planned with 2 or 3 other people, and they are very special. It's something I keep in my prayer corner, is just this little narrowboat to remind me of that experience. It's Robert's got one too. There's the matching narrowboats. There you go. The narrowboat club. But yeah, everybody has that, and I think so. Peter's idea of trying to tease out of people what those, because we might be surprised by what people come up with. And I know when you ask this question, the first person to put their hand up will say a mountaintop, and you think, I don't know why I do that, but I can think, oh, come on, how often do you go on a mountaintop? Really? How often do you go on a mountaintop? Never, but I experienced God there. Yeah, Robert.
Well, it's just I was thinking about how there's the going away thing, stepping away. But when you say that to people, they're generally, the idea is you get on an aeroplane and travel to some place where you're supposed to be happy because you're on holiday. And again, the narrowboat, because that's such a sort of so different, so small. And as you've heard me say, you know, you can be in the middle of Birmingham or loads of cities, and you're in a different world. You don't, but there's something about the idea of going off on this holiday. I know the phrase I was trying to think of is you go to make memories. I sort of always, you don't make memories. Memories happen because you're doing something, or you're in one of these places, and they can't be manufactured. So it's, again, for me, always this countercultural thing. The way to make memories, the way to be happy, is to go off to Florida and spend 2 weeks visiting Disney World and all this sort of thing. No, for me, the way is to go to some horrible, grotty little place, get on a boat with a diesel engine and put down a canal. You know, it's nothing to do with, you can't buy this stuff. I suppose that's what I want to say.
Yeah. Listen.
I was just thinking to myself there, I was just thinking about mountaintops. And part of the reason why, I think, is because you can't just stroll to a mountaintop. You can, Phil and I walked up Snowdon a few years ago. You can actually just get a train up Snowdon, but it just, to me, that doesn't feel the same thing. We didn't get the mountaintop experience because we got to the top and you couldn't see a thing. And there's something about, but I still felt exhilarated because I had walked all the way up there, and that was a real challenge. And I just wonder whether sometimes part of the experience is thinking about the work that has to be done to get there. So I think part of the thing about a mountaintop is then you just, the vista is huge and different, but there's a sense of achievement in that as well, because you've had to do the work. So I think there might be something about doing the work. And there might also be something about intentionality. You can't manufacture an experience with God, but you can go out looking for them. And I suppose that's what we'd call pilgrimage, isn't it? So when you go on the narrowboat, which I think sounds awful. It's not my thing at all. One of my places is John Lewis, where they have all the sheets out and the cushions and things. Which for Phil, you see, look at Phil's face.
You can't have a minister's week in John Lewis.
No, I know, but there's something about intentionality, and maybe Sunday mornings are just too easy for people because all you have to do is stroll in and sit down. Maybe there's something about being intentional about, at this time, this is where, you know, I want to encounter God, and what is it that's stopping me do that, and how can I? So it's not just about the place, but about the person that you're taking with you in all of that. I just thought, I'll stop now because I'm gibbering, but I just thought there was something about the work to be done to get to a mountaintop. Maybe that's something about it, and also the intentionality of being ready to meet Jesus and encounter Jesus in whatever place.
Right, yeah, and it's not gibberish or gibbering. Most people, when they write about pilgrimage, talk about the pilgrimage not really being the place at which you arrive, but the journey that you take to get there, isn't it? Which is why it's one of the things I reflected on when I did drive around or ride around all these sites, was that I asked myself, why have I never really been that fussed about visiting these places that have been ancient sites of pilgrimage throughout my life? I've been to many of them, and I think one of my reflections amongst many was that quite often I'd driven there on holiday, parked nearby in a car park, walked in, paid me admission, had a look around, then gone again, and there was no effort involved, there was no intentionality. It was just visiting a place, looking for, well, what makes this place so magic? Well, the answer is nothing makes this place so magic, but the intentionality and the journey of pilgrimage to get there was the thing that that made it so. Often they were going to visit relics, weren't they? That's how it started, and get brownie points, and indulgences, and all that kind of stuff. But people talk about the prayers of countless thousands being seeping into the walls, and most of my brain says, no, that's superstitious tosh. But there is still a part of my brain which says, I experienced that. You sit in some of these places and you can actually experience that. And a rational brain really resists it, but there is a little bit of it that refuses to be resisted, that there is something about ancient stones and places where people have lived those lives and struggled and wanted to be there and gone to encounter God. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, and I think following on from that, Philip, that's where you get the same sort of thing in church life with special seasons and ordinary. You know, if you look at the lectionary, you've got the special times, Epiphany and Advent and Lent and Easter, and then the rest's just labelled ordinary time. Ordinary. And what do we mean by that? You know, and actually, does that play out in the way people arrive at church? I mean, if you get people together on a Christmas Eve service, there is a totally in a packed church. Just get that, will you, Robert? If you if you if you think about it, the level of expectation is totally different on a Christmas Eve than, say, 2 Sundays after Christmas on a Sunday morning. And in a sense, it's about somehow having that level of expectation of encounter that every day with God.
Yeah, I think that's very profound. And I wonder sometimes, I wonder this after Christmas. I think, why am I so exhausted after Christmas? I mean, it's work, but it's not like ridiculous. But I think part of the exhaustion isn't just doing all the services. It's, in one sense, carrying the weight of expectation of everybody wanting to have special moments at Christmas. And if you blow it by doing a rubbish carol service, whereas on an ordinary Sunday you can get away with it because there's another one next week, but at Christmas or Easter people are waiting for it, and it's on your shoulders somehow as a preacher or a worship leader to deliver an experience, which I think is part of the weight that makes it so exhausting. Yeah, Robert.
Well, it was this thing about veils and taking the veil off. So I was thinking, is the taking the veil off, when the veil's off, it's a thin place, a thin space, because we see God more clearly or sense God more clearly. And then I was thinking about what you were saying. So that's everybody's expectation is upon the worship leader to take the veil off for them at those times, and you feel that weight of responsibility. Yeah, I think about some of these great comedians. I'm not saying we like comedians, but who suffered because the more successful they were, the more they feared that the next thing they did wouldn't be so good, and so it became more and more pressure. I think there's an element of that in what you're saying. But it just struck me that it's something about the veil. We live these veiled lives, and then there are just those occasions when the curtain's pulled back, we could say, and we see God more clearly.
Cool. Talk of pulling curtains back maybe leads us nicely into visual things you could do in a service. I'm now thinking of how can we pull curtains back to reveal something meaningful to the congregation. There must be a way of doing that. But let's go around the room again and see if people have got some ideas about how they might use other parts of the service to bring these readings to life in people's lives. Peter, what's in your...
I've just got 2 really simple things, really. The first one is Be Still for the Presence of the Lord is a song that's really, really well known to people. I was thinking we could use it quite dramatically, use it as several voices and poetry, don't sing it at all, have space and allow people to really think about the words of the hymn for a change. Because when you pull that one apart, it is all about presence. It is the power of the Lord. It is being in awe of the Lord. It's I find it really powerful when you stop and actually think about the words that we sing, and often they relate brilliantly to being used in different ways. So I'd be looking for something that was quite a dramatic reading of people who could really do justice to it, and helping us to think about actually how do we allow those words to become real for us. And then I thought alongside of that, The other thing, I'd be encouraging people to think about their special places where they feel, the thin places where they encounter God. Could you create one of those spaces either in your home or your garden, so that actually it was there? It isn't somewhere you have to even go to, but it's actually close enough that it's tangible and real at home, so that you could use that space day by day.
And one of the many books I've read about prayer, in an effort to finally once and for all sort out my prayer life. I remember vividly the first chapter, and the imagery was about sort of like a house of prayer or something, and it was about the first chapter was about finding that place, and the writer sort of wrote about loads of different circumstances or people that they'd encountered who'd found that kind of place in their own house. And for some people, it was like a posh little booth down the garden where they could always go for peace and quiet and never be disturbed because they had a nice big garden and a shed or something. For other people, it was literally just a chair in the corner of the kitchen amidst all the mess, but it was the chair that they went to. And this writer was saying it's important to find, just because that's the place you go with intentionality. And when I sit on this chair in this corner, that's when I'm intentionally seeking God. Of course, we should be seeking God all the time, but that's the moment where I'm setting aside something intentional. I think that's really important. I've got a little corner here, but I just allow it to be completely overwhelmed by bags and stuff, and it's where the barge sits on that shelf in the corner, and a couple of other bits and pieces that I fancifully think will inspire me to prayer. But it's just a chair in the corner of my study. I have more luxury of more space than many people do, but it's a tiny corner. My study is really quite small. But yeah, I think that finding that space would be a really creative thing to ask people, because it would actually send them away in the week to plan something, make something, arrange something. I think that'd be really creative. Robert, you were going to say something.
Well, I was just thinking about if you had a place or created a space, then knowing it was there, perhaps you could, in a sense, be carrying it with you, and it'd be like those booths, the tabernacles that they took with them. I wondered if you could talk to people about that. Just jumped into my mind.
I think Eastern Synod's mission enabler talked at the Minister's Spring School about having a portable space, which was basically a bag with some bits in, which I thought was interesting. And Lithan may remember it better than me, but there were just bits in this bag, and she would take it with her to different places when she was going, and then take the bits out the bag, and it's a portable space.
Yeah, it's a small box with a pebble and a cross and things and prayer beads. She says she's quite a fidgeter, so they're kind of fidgety things that she can hold and kind of play with and pray with at the same time.
Right, so this is Nicola. Credit to Nicola.
It's Lindsay, though.
No, I told you it was Lindsay. I'll edit that out. Lindsay does that. Right. Where are we up to? We haven't come to Lithan's real ideas yet. So where are you going, Lithan?
It would depend where I was. So if I was in a congregation that I'd been with at least some of Epiphany, and I thought it was worth the risk, we could try doing a bit of a recap, seeing what people remember of the aha moments from the Kings to Transfiguration, because we'll have had some of the different readings and stories along the way. I say it's a risk because I once did a quiz on the minor prophets after a series, and no one could even remember a name of a minor prophet. So it can be a bit dispiriting, but you can give clues along the way. And I think it's just a good reminder of what the season is all about: revelation or aha moments, from grand ones to simpler ones, but they're all things that help us to understand who Jesus is. Or this one's a bit more trite. If you've got people who are willing to have a go, you can have blindfolds and packets of crisps. So people have to try and taste the crisp while blindfolded to see if they can work out the flavour, because actually sometimes it's only when you can see face to face that you actually can understand what the flavour is, and that's kind of with Transfiguration, taking off the blindfold. Or maybe more simply, if you're able to print out different works of art of the Transfiguration and share them. So this is probably, if it's a smaller congregation, people can pick which one speaks to them and why, and that might help us to just explore what Transfiguration means to us. Because for some people it will be a really, numinous was the word that came to mind, it's just something ineffable and extraordinary, and for others there's something really although it's a very strange thing, there's something really grounded in seeing who Jesus is, and maybe art can help people explore that.
Cool. That's one thing I didn't do this week, because I didn't look up paintings of the Transfiguration, because I assumed somebody else would show us a bunch of pictures of the Transfiguration, but Neil's not with us, so I probably shouldn't assume that.
I do have two, and then I thought, and that's kind of why I thought about this idea, is because they're two that really speak to me, but they're very modern, figurative ones. They're not abstract, and they're not ancient. So I thought, actually, if I just show the ones that mean a lot to me, that's not going to mean anything to other people. So actually having the choice and then having a discussion that comes from that would be good.
Yep. Robert, are you taking the congregation on your barge?
Well, any excuse. No, I was thinking, Lethan mentioned climbing Snowdon, or walking up Snowdon. When I was a youngster, we climbed a mountain near Snowdon, and walked up it, called Cnicht, Cnicht. And I remember sitting on the top of this mountain and looking down and seeing all of the, well, not all of these, a tiny car going along a lane to the car park where you started the walk from. And so I always, when we think about this mountaintop experience, I always think of that image comes into my mind, and the idea of going up a mountain. Sometimes things become clear, so you see God clearly. And I had this idea of getting some of those pictures, photographs that are hugely magnified, so that you see like a grain of sugar as a diamond, and asking people if they could work out what they were, perhaps doing a series of those. That was one idea. Some of the things Lethan's talked about. And I can't imagine doing this because I think it would be putting too much pressure on the congregation. But the idea of stepping away and seeing everything clearly, so perhaps asking people if they might, in groups, sort of come up with a short summary of the gospel, what Jesus was about. So I found one here. It says, Jesus was born in a stable. Jesus taught people how to live good lives. Jesus told stories that made people think about what's important. Jesus healed people, and so it goes on like that. But whether you could do that as a matter, because stepping away, then you see the whole thing rather than being so close in and you can't. So stuff like that.
Yeah, listen.
I've only been doing this 2 years now. Go back to what Peter was saying earlier about where we should worship. Perhaps if you've got the right kind of congregation, this would be a Sunday to say, and we're going to go up a hill. I then thought, oh yeah, we have what's called a hill near where we live, Robert, but it's like a mound, a tiny mound.
I spent 2 weeks looking for the hill until I asked someone where it was, and then realised I'd been up and down it 10 times.
So this is more difficult in East Anglia, but again, you don't want it to be a mountain for people, but actually to be out, maybe just say we're worshipping outside, doesn't matter what the weather is like, and we'll go for a walk, maybe to a quiet place, and then but perhaps also make sure that you go back into something, that it's not just all woofy, but that it's grounded at the end in where we are. But just kind of taking that idea further of the difference between mountaintop experiences, but that's not all there is. They're there to help us in our everyday life.
Your story about Snowdon and us walking up Snowdon and it being totally invisible at the top with the clouds. I mean, that is what happened here in Luke. They didn't have a glorious sweeping view of everything else because the clouds came down. They were lost in clouds, weren't they? So that's pretty much exactly what happened in Luke. By the way, top Welsh pronunciation there, Robert. Was that Canicht? Was it? Yeah. How was that, Lithan?
Oh yeah, and we should actually say yr Wyddfa now, not Snowdon.
You can't say
Snowdon. Snowdon's changed its name to yr Wyddfa. And I was just smiling to myself that I bought a T-shirt at the top to signify. That's my booth. I have a T-shirt.
That's your booth.
I went up to Snowdon. Yr Wyddfa.
Just to prove I was here. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Of course, Peter will be wearing a brand new jacket to worship this week. Having given away all his clothes last week, he had the perfect excuse to go and buy a new one, which he will be giving away at the end of the service again. Any final ideas before we wrap up? No, we have been talking absolute worship for about an hour. And we understand how challenging it can be sometimes to, week after week, help congregations grapple with some of these texts and help bring them to life in people's lives. We'll be doing that this week, or apart from me and Lithan will be on holiday, but we would be doing it if we could. And we want to bless you as you prepare for it this week, or however far in advance you're preparing. Robert is going to pray with us as we set about that task.
Yeah, let's pray together. So, loving God, we've been chatting together about the readings for Transfiguration Sunday, thinking about how the veil was drawn away from people's eyes, how people went up a mountain to be close to you. We have discussed, we've puzzled, and we know that those preparing will probably puzzle too, how best to illustrate these passages and this experience. We pray that in all we do, we may help those who come to hear us find some thin space in their lives where they can sense the presence of God and be encouraged to go out into the world and live lives of faith. Be with us all, be with all those who listen and watch this online. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.